Welcome to Beyond Blueprints. I'm Andrew Smith, and today we're delighted to be joined by Ben Anstey, who's a Director of Electrical Systems at Volta Trucks. Great for you to join us today, Ben. I wanted to kick off. You've got an illustrious CV, I've got to say, to get the flattery in early. Could you tell us and listeners a little bit about your background in kind of renewable and automotive?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Firstly, thanks so much for letting me join this today and looking forward to it. So I have had a career that's broadly stemmed automotive and renewables, always been in tech startup and therefore small companies with kind of big dreams. Some of them have been successful, some of them less so. But that kind of brings some of the kind of learning personally, both technically and kind of professionally. So I started off in renewables doing photovoltaics. So that's kind of the solar PV side of the industry back when there was lots of grant funding for developing new products in niche markets. So that was a spin out of the university and had a great time there. Learned a lot about what it meant to be in a small organisation and covering lots of things beyond your role remit. Sadly, that unfortunately didn't make it into the production phase, but we did get very, very close. But through that, one door closed and one door opened, and through a chance appointment through a friend, I got into McLaren Automotive. So a quick transition into automotive where I really didn't understand a lot about the technologies at the beginning, but very much a great playground to learn, a great bunch of people, great technologies, and so very fast. And in the time I was there, we launched over 15 products in that time, which was just under 8 years. And I went from being an engineer owning parts and solving problems daily to being the manager of the electronics department, looking after our full remit of vehicles and the portfolio of technologies moving forward. And that was exhilarating, a lot of exposure there. But I felt that personally I wanted to move more into kind of the EV space. And so the opportunity arose to join Rivian, who back then were a stealth company. No one had really heard of them. And so I joined quite early on, helped them through some of the early development of the R1 platform and the Amazon product that's now running around on the roads. And was involved in some of those kind of key decisions at the beginning, building out the team, understanding a bit about kind of how they designed and delivered products and the engineering processes that were then kicked off and have been carried forward. But as COVID kind of hit and the world changed, and being in the wrong continent, I brought myself back into what I could do in the UK and found myself in Volta Trucks, another fledgling startup, completely different product, but Rivian had given me that kind of insight into kind of impact in commercial vehicles, which is completely different to passenger vehicles, both in the way you approach the problem, but also in kind of what you can kind of do with the kind of product and its kind of impact to the planet. And so Volta has been the last 3.5 years of my life, and from there I kind of built a team and technology, which I guess we'll discuss a little bit about today, hopefully.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for that. Thanks for that potted summary. Firstly, I'm really interested in the fact that you've experienced kind of both ends of the spectrum, the kind of the large organization, I guess, with McLaren, kind of large and established, but rapid product growth. And on the other hand, which I'm sure we're going to come on to, what it's like starting from absolute scratch and growing the team. So I think you're a perfect guest for that. To jump in a little bit about kind of Volta, for those who don't know, so it's electric trucks for sustainable cities. And I was reading it's the world's first 16-ton purpose-built all-electric truck. First question that came to my mind, and you alluded to it a little bit there, we're all familiar with EV cars. What are the unique challenges that you face when making an EV truck?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, they have the same paradigm. I mean, you're still trying to electrify a powertrain and you're trying to either take benefit from some of those opportunities if you do it ground up, and some of them are challenges that need to be solved because it's quite a fledgling technology and therefore some of it's not proven yet. I mean, one thing that's been true of all the companies I've worked at, and it stayed true in Volta when we set out to deliver the product, is defining the problem you're trying to solve and putting kind of the customer-centric side of the design ethos first. And McLaren was good for that, and it's where I kind of learned that. And Rivian continued that with its unique properties. But even in the truck industry, we tried to set out and deliver something which was safe in an urban environment, not through the use of technology at times, just through the use of better design by innovating in a battery vehicle where previously you'd convert. We also looked at what it meant to be an operator and how the driver it's their office on wheels. And so how can you interact with the product differently? How can you, do a job, but do it in a way that is enabled by the new platform? I mean, fundamentally, the big difference, though, is that a commercial vehicle is not bought by a single individual. So you move from a B2C type environment to a B2B environment. And therefore, the question of who are you designing for and who are you selling to becomes separate. And so it's a very different operation now where your fleet owner is thinking about total cost of ownership and they're a lot more driven by the cost of servicing, the cost to buy, the cost of energy throughout the lifetime. All of those metrics become the total cost of ownership. But actually, the person you're driving the design towards is maybe the technician in the workshop, make it easier to service, or the driver, as I said, in the office environment, or even vulnerable road users. You want you want to make a product which is safe for those cyclists, pedestrians, and all of that was what we were trying to achieve, even if they're not the customer of the product. So commercial vehicles opened my eyes to a whole different side of what you can design for, but reminded me that actually it has a function. And the function is to move goods from A to B under some configuration. And so with all of the technology and the jazz we were trying to kind of put into the product, it still had to be competitive. It still had to deliver on a total cost of ownership model, or it just wouldn't pass the fleet manager test.
So it's really a more kind of nuanced customer environment then, because you're trying to please multiple kind of customer stakeholders in a way that is very different from that consumer environment.
Well, again, I'd make some similarities. So I think you have to be clear on what you are and are not. So we were an inner urban distribution company. We were looking at a particular segment of payload, and therefore it naturally brings itself to different applications. Like, it's not a fire truck, it's not a it's not a refuse truck. And so you have in one sense, you have a very narrow design field with which you're trying to hit. But then within that, any customer can use it for any operation. They might want refrigerated, ambient, or they might want tailless or not, or it might be a completely different application that we've not considered. So you have to be broad in your understanding of how it can be used to keep the options open, but quite focused on the product you are selling. And I guess in passenger vehicles, that's no different to when people make SUVs. An SUV has become a bell curve of, it satisfies your school run, it satisfies your ski holiday, it satisfies your DIY runs, but in effect, it's trying to be a crossover, where a sports car at the end of the day is a very niche product with a very singular application. And people buy vehicles for different reasons in that sense, just like they do in the commercial vehicle sense too. So there's lots of similarities.
Sports cars, less, goods from A to B, just getting them there very fast.
I don't know. We still had quite challenging targets around how many golf clubs you needed to carry, because that's the demographic with which they buy it. I mean, it's still a packaging challenge, whether it's relatively small or it's relatively high payload.
Still got to get a set of those into the boot.
Yeah,
great. I want to tap into that broader experience of yours, Ben, because going from concept to production, very challenging. What it takes to turn a great idea into a reality that's practical. You've obviously operated in this space in several different companies. From the big picture perspective, how do you see that process, concept to production?
Yeah, so first it depends whether you're in an organization that has legacy and platform, because it's much harder to approach this if you've got existing product or an existing organization. And I don't envy those companies that are trying to transform at speed and develop. That's not an easy task. I think in all the environments I've worked, typically we've had a blank piece of paper, and that's allowed us to approach the problem we're trying to design for. And then in my mind, holistically, it brings in kind of three things. Yes, you've got to have a good idea, and that needs to be formed around what it is you're trying to solve. And you need to understand that, because if you don't, then everything else is kind of born out of a very unclear vision. But then at the point you move into now delivering something, then I've always likened it into kind of three different pillars that we're kind of trying to adapt to, which is, one is you must have the technology in order to deliver the problem. And that sometimes is about integration, sometimes it's about solving technical problems, or a combination thereof. But you also need to have the people. I mean, the people at the end of the day are what make an organization and bring that technology to the forefront. But process is one that, at the beginning of my career, I used to see as quite a negative. I was very anti-process. So it slowed me down, or I didn't understand all these ideas and metrics and KPIs. It felt like a manager's tool. But in reality, I've come to realize through doing this kind of a few times now, that well-organized process created by the teams that are using them in the purpose in which they need to be used, that then enable those amazing people to then do less of the process, or at least less of the kind of the repeatable heavy lifting bit, to make sure they focus purely on the technical challenges that lay ahead. And eventually, when you move from concept into production, some of those technical challenges become less uncertain. Concept is all about uncertainty and trying to work out the best way to approach it. When you're in the pre-production phase, in theory, you have quite a lot of certainty, but your hurdles now are very much around kind of bringing a supply chain on board, or bringing all that kind of complex data to stable, reliable. And that's when you benefit from all of that process that you put in place at the beginning. But it's about understanding where you are in the life cycle and what's fit for purpose for that stage of the development cycle.
Yeah, it makes total sense with those pillars. I do want to dive into a little bit more depth on each of those, actually, because I think that's a really neat way to break it down. So first off, let's talk about the technology. So I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind for most people. It's maybe the only thing if you're not in the industry, you think it's just the technology challenge you have to sort, but you got to work out what you're building. And I guess from prototype to mass manufacture, that can be a bumpy journey.
Yeah. So again, I'll kind of repeat there. You've got to know what you're trying to solve. So in my mind, there's two things. Once you know the product problem you're trying to solve, it's easy to map certain technologies to that. I think you also need a kind of an R&D thread where you don't yet know what problem you're trying to solve. You're trying to explore the art of possibility in technology, and that R&D thread may not always come to fruition. You might find an idea works, but you don't know an application for it, or an idea just doesn't land, and therefore it's not the right route to take. So you've kind of got these two threads coming into the concept phase where you've got maturing tech and you've got a problem that you're trying to solve irrespective of how you come about it. I think once you know the problem you're trying to solve, concept can begin. And at that point, you're really focused on trying to look at the different ways in which you could go about it. And sometimes it might be a bought solution, or it might be an in-house vertically integrated solution, or it might be a hybrid of these. And the balancing act is always trying to work out what's the sweet spot for your organization. And sometimes the driver is cost. Sometimes the driver is the control or quality that you want to achieve. Sometimes, as it was for us at Volta, it was timing based. Actually, what we set out to do was a product in a particular time frame. And therefore, a lot of our decisions were born out of, is that technology at a maturity level suitable for us to take it through the phases that we're about to face in order to hit our milestones moving forward? And that was either to unlock a major investment round, prove out a proof of concept, or maybe to hit an engineering phase or hit a certification phase. And so sometimes the technology decisions for us were born out of, yes, they must meet a set of attributes, but they also have to be available and or deliverable in the time frame we've allowed ourselves, or else that was a decision to move away from that approach or that technology. Sometimes it took us the other way, and it took us into the realm of, I need to do this in a short space of time. The traditional tier one base will not adapt to our timeline. And if they do, they're not going to do it in the way that we want them to. And it forced us to look at internalizing that design. So for example, the wiring harnesses on a truck, there's kilometers of wiring harness. If you went down a traditional full service route and went to a tier one and said, I want to be a big project, you do the design and you build and you support in series, they'd have wanted more years than the whole program. So then we had to then say, well, actually, we don't have a design on day one. We know it's going to take us a period to understand our own requirements. And then all you're left with is, we'll have to design that in-house. So that then brings with it more people, more different experiences for those people than you would perhaps have in a normal organization. But also, what tool are you going to use, and how are you going to bring that process to link to the 3D environment, and then how are you going to build to print thereafter? And it changed everything about what we did downstream, born out of first to market, how long is the program, that commodity takes longer, therefore we made a make versus buy decision. And we did that in a few places, but they were always tactical. If you could buy it and it was readily available, that's the route we would take. If you couldn't, we would invest in bringing up an in-house vertical because it was the necessity to integrate the product at speed. So technology is a tricky one, but it was a balancing act.
And when it comes to that make versus buy decision, because I think for all the engineers listening, that's something we're all very familiar with, that kind of that balancing act. When you're going through that period of growth, are there ever times where you make the call and then on review later, actually it's time to pivot away, or over time, do you just get better at making that call?
I think it's a bit of both, and there's no right answer to this. I think people make mistakes, and you've got to acknowledge those and pivot if you find you have with whatever data you had available at the time. I liken it to decisions that are one way or two way. So if a decision is clearly one way, and if you make that decision, there is no time left in the program to pivot, then you might take a different approach on the amount of data you need or the amount of time you take to make that decision, even if it comes with a bit of delay to the end of the program. That's a balanced delay because you're looking at it from a one-way decision. If it's a two-way decision, and actually at any point more data could come in and you could say, do you know what, I could do this the other way, or I could change the approach, then actually you might take less information to quickly make a decision so that people can move forward. And then from that, you will decide along the way if you did make the right decision or not. We had examples of that across the program, whether we picked a supplier that we thought was mature and we believed in the interests of the program, they were mature, and then later you find out with the data available it wasn't. And so maybe you have to then say it's a late time to change supplier, but I can do this at this point. I couldn't do it in 3 months' time if I still believe we've made the wrong decision. And so you just have to pivot and react to the data.
Okay, it's a really interesting one. As you were talking there, I was thinking about your speciality, particularly in electrical engineering. Back when you were entering into the the photovoltaic space to now, I feel like I don't want to say we've got a better appreciation for electrical engineers. We always appreciate them, but everybody's talking about them. I feel like there's a huge demand for them now. Has that meant that what's the question maybe before here? I feel like in 2008 we weren't really talking a great deal about electronics, whereas now it feels like everybody has an opinion on it. Has that made it a more challenging environment for you to get your kind of technical expertise across?
No, I mean, again, within an organization, it communicates both ways. So management, I think, is more aware of the need, and therefore it's a bit more of a, what are we doing about our software strategy, or have we got enough software resource? The terms float around because people are more sensitive to what is this underpinning complexity. I think the truth of it is, though, it's not any single skill set. What I think is happening is the industry is becoming more complex, and this isn't just automotive. It's aerospace, it's satellites, it's all the different industries that are delivering complex systems of systems. It's gone from a world where you typically relied on a tier one and they provided you a complete solution, and it didn't really integrate that heavily. I'm not underplaying it. I just mean the complexity is changing. Mm-hmm. And now you, as a end user, an OEM delivering a product, you have to think about it from the customer viewpoint, which means you have to derive it in a systems engineering approach. So it's not electrical engineers you need more of, it's systems engineers you need more of, it's process and DevOps engineers you need more of, it's software if you're going to take it on in-house. But if you're not taking it on in-house, you still need engineers expert in how to manage, deploy and test software, because you're still responsible for the end product and the quality that your customer receives. So the broad term of electrical engineering, yes, I think is coming more into play, but actually I think there are niche skill sets within the life cycle of complex system development where you could come from a mechanical background. If you understand the problems that I'm describing, then you'll make just as good a systems engineer, whether you can code or not, or you can, lay out a PCB or not. You're still an effective engineer in the life cycle of complex design.
Off the back of that, so I think you've spoken a bit about kind of the what of the technology and that make versus buy decision. When it comes to, as you're scaling up, the where you actually source that technology from, is that something you can speak to about what goes into that decision as the orders of magnitude of production change?
Yeah, I mean, every company's different, so I can only give you my views of what I've been exposed to or we've done, but you have to think about your manufacturing location. You have to think about where your part base is coming from, because there's lots of imports and taxes and all the rest of it that come from the current geographic situation we find ourselves. You have to think about if you're scaling, are you always going to build in that facility, or are you going to end up with multi-sites? Because that might change some of your early decisions. So dual sourcing, for example, is it okay to have a single source on a single part, or do you need to think about from the beginning dual source, or is that something you can tackle as an afterthought, because actually the design is what you're focused on and then multiple ways to achieve it? And I think all of these come into your decision-making process. At the point at which you're nominating a supplier, some OEMs will want all of that information up front, but it requires a longer period of understanding before you make some of those decisions. And that's not bad or right, or, it's not good or bad, it's just a different way of approaching it. But if you're willing to make fast decisions, you have to understand the risk you carry in the event that one or any of those things change in the future. And so you need to map it the other way in that sense. If you then want to locate yourself in another continent, are you going to repeat the contract manufacturing model? Are you going to repeat your supply base, or are you going to encourage your current suppliers to invest in another geography, because that reduce your imports and so forth? So there's no right answer. There's just a business-wide kind of how do you approach the decision matrix, and what do you weigh into your decision-making process beyond technical?
Yeah, and I guess being willing to go back and reevaluate and not just get kind of stuck to a decision in the early days. I'm keen to ask, and feel free to plead the fifth on this one, Ben. But if you've got any specific examples of those issues and solutions in that technology scaling from concept to production, from your direct experiences in the companies you worked in.
Yeah, I mean, probably a nice one, which was quite unique to the experience that we had at Volta, is that we happened to start the company during the pandemic, which gave us a big challenge anyway in terms of recruiting and scaling in a remote environment. But that was one challenge. The problem we found quite quickly when we got going is that the business was facing a unprecedented amount of regulation change. So automotive hasn't typically changed a lot year on year until more recently, when the general safety regulations came in, and vehicles are getting a lot more regulated for good reason. They are bringing a lot of safety requirements that make just passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles and buses alike just safer really for both the driver and vulnerable road users. This is a good thing for the industry, but it's happening quite quickly. And versus previous changes, which might have been much more kind of akin to a mechanical design shift, these are not simple features to add. These are things like blind spot monitoring, they're emergency braking systems. They're things we're all aware of from our passenger vehicles, but the delivery of these are not straightforward. What we found at Volta is that we were coming at the problem at a point when this was cutting over. And if we delivered on our current timeline, we would be the wrong side of the change. And if we tried to do it this side, some of the technologies weren't quite ready. So one of the biggest challenges we faced, and it really was a jeopardy for the business, was can we whole vehicle certify in what I felt like was an unprecedented amount of time. So from a standing start, we achieved that in less than 18 months. We did it completely with the regulatory bodies involved and our technical advisors and the groups that were there to interpret for us and help us understand what it meant to certify. And we therefore, in effect, I like it, it's kind of like a deconstructed Eton mess. Most people would do all the development, sign the product off, and then they would go and just apply for certification on a finished product. Well, we had to do it the other way around, which is to say, what are the elements of certification and what is it that you need to demonstrate? And instead of having one asset in effect that you could do it on, you'd have ways of demonstrating that the system was compliant to steering, to braking, to HV systems, whatever it might be. And we pieced all this together with the support of our regulatory team and our independent advisors. And we did achieve. So it went from being a problem that would have put the business into jeopardy if we didn't achieve it. And we actually struck that within 48 hours of the cutover. And that locked in our whole vehicle type approval and thus allowed us to continue for the next 2 years under that kind of design authority.
Wow, it must have been a bit of a seat of the pants moment. I've also written down for future reference, deconstructed Eton mess. I thought an Eton mess was deconstructed already, but I'm going to nick that one.
Oh, maybe it is. No, you probably got it right, isn't it?
As a reconstructed Eton
mess. Eton mess is a deconstructed Pavlova, isn't it? You should know.
Yes, yeah. Well, I do love a baked analogy. It is known. A great example there. So moving from the tech pillar. The tech is great, but if you're going to hit a deadline like that, 48 hours to go, you've never been done before, 18 months, you need a cracking bunch of people to do that job. And you alluded yourself, you started off kind of in the engineering side, and then you had to get more into this people domain. What was that like, casting your mind back to when you kind of first started taking on people responsibility? What was that learning curve like?
Steep. And full of failures on my part, with lots of opportunities for public reflection.
Tell us about all of those. Tell us about.
Yeah, my camera's kind of zoomed out at me a little bit.
It looked like it was giving you anonymity there, like those kind of backlit documentaries.
Yeah, right. So the very first opportunity I had to manage, I wasn't provided a huge amount of support, and I had responsibility to deliver, but not much support in how to kind of get the best out of people, and so. I've made this claim publicly before. Those individuals stood by me and they gave me a lot of support and a lot of freedom where I suspect I could have been judged differently. One of the hardest things I found is that I came up a vertical, and that vertical I understood and I could talk to the individuals responsible because it was my background, and it allowed me to get closer to or further from, depending on which way you want to look at it, anything involving those. The other technologies, I felt exposed. On a personal level, I'd always been someone that wanted to understand something before I could converse in it. And it took me probably a couple of years to realize that I wasn't the expert. I also shouldn't be the expert, and I didn't need to be the expert. And I think once I had that kind of revelation, I realized that my interactions with the individual responsible was much more around qualifying, have I been clear on what it is we need to do? Have you got any questions about what it is we need to do? And are you giving me confidence that you understand and you've got a plan? And are we kind of, transactionally supporting each other through the next period? And when risks came up, I was more reading the person and their reaction to the problem than whether I necessarily understood how severe it was. And so very quickly it became apparent that at a certain level, you're responsible for managing personalities, and each person is different. They approach information differently. And so it was less about being a technical expert. And actually, I started to realize having smarter people around me, as the cliched statement always is, actually protected the organization more than trying to be the smartest person in the room. But I did, though, manage to, as a personality trait, learn from these individuals. And I would always try and understand a bit more about their world to get a bit closer to it, to the point where I was less intimidated, even if I still couldn't do it myself. I've just tried to carry that forward, really, in terms of how I think about building teams and recruiting people. And and allowing them to be expert in what they're expert and to communicate with me and where they need help, not the other way around, not chase them.
I think that's a really good insight, because certainly speaking from my own engineering experience, and I know a lot of those listening will relate to that as well. From maybe being in kind of a specialist, you get to the stage where you're starting to pick up more of the kind of the people domain of responsibility. I think people really struggle to make that change about not having to own all the technical knowledge. I've seen it before. People just get overwhelmed. They're trying to cover everything, and then the plates,
Yeah.
start dropping. So I think that's a really solid piece of advice.
Well, there's also the other side of that as well. I think once I realised that side, the other bit I realised is you're not always, but you're the interface to the other part of the organisation at times. It depends how you structured your team, but suddenly now you have a different role, which is you have to be clear on what is being asked, because it's not always clear. It's never defined in a way that tells you exactly how to lead the team, and therefore, if you don't understand or ask enough questions doing your job, then also you're not cascading the right information down. So again, you can create a different problem by being ineffective in what you're responsible for now, irrespective of whether you've handed back that kind of technical responsibility.
Yeah, if you spend all your time looking kind of down
You never look up.
organization, yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
really, 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 really useful insight. So you've kind of been thrown in at the deep end, come out of it on top, so to speak. Now moving on into kind of, I guess, some of those smaller companies, you are having a really major influence on how those organizations grow at that point, and you start to think about how you're building a team from scratch.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've personally tried to do is not put myself into the position that I'm responsible for until the last minute. So the early days at Volta, I remember being with a group of people, but very responsible for how do we want this organization to be built? Like, what tools do we want to use collectively? Not what do I want to use or my team need to use. And I think from that, we took, as long as we could, we staved off this idea that there was this kind of, old fashioned way of doing things, because that's always been done that way. And we enabled us to take a bit more of a kind of a holistic view of the type of organization, the type of culture, the type of way of working. Eventually, you need to fill in all the different organizational pillars, and people became responsible and you handed the tasks over. And then what I was left with was effectively what my job role was. But up until that point, I had a kind of an equal and opposite share in trying to form what it was that we were doing, as much as it was how we were doing it. And then I kind of, pivoted back into doing my piece. But I really enjoy that. And I think it's because I see more and more in the ways in which things are working really well, until you get to the point where it touches someone else's world or someone else's interface or system, and then it just kind of locks horns. And it's only unfortunate because someone didn't sit down and architect them both at the same time, even if they didn't flesh out the details. They just didn't see that these two processes end up meeting. Eventually concept meets production. Eventually issues in test meet production. And if you think about it in the view of the whole piece, then actually it's quite a simple web, and then you fill in the details to make your day-to-day processes and tools that then deliver upon that organizational output.
Yeah, yeah. Before we go on to touching on our final P, the process, I've heard it said before, some people who are kind of working those engineering companies early on, they say the most important role I have, apart from some of the technology stuff we're doing, is making sure I'm bringing in the right people, because that will then just define everything that happens. How much importance did you find you were putting on that when you were scaling up a team, especially in those early days when it's a really small team size?
Huge amount. And one of the things you got to remember is you earn a culture, you create a culture, you don't define a culture. And so yes, it's somewhat intentional in the way in which you behave. You can steer a culture with some intentional values. I mean, Rivian did this really well, and they put a lot of effort into it before they even recruited. But you basically, as you start recruiting, if you're 10 and you hire 10 people, 50% of your company doesn't understand your culture yet, and they're looking to you. So they actually become the culture without you knowing it. And so you've got to be very careful that you bring that up. One of my old colleagues used to say, it's like a bathtub, and you don't want to put lukewarm water in, it's cooling the bath. You want to always put hotter water than the bath is and bring the temperature up. Otherwise, you're just going to naturally cool that down. So
it's a great analogy.
I put a massive amount of emphasis into it. And part of that was about considering the organization that I needed to build and the kind of the verticals within which the competencies needed to be. And then I recruited from the top down. And I mean that in the sense of I went and found the hands-on technical manager who could on day one do the job while they were finding the people, but also they were capable of building the team under the vision that together we would set out, yet to be defined. And that meant that actually I wasn't building a team and then putting managers over the top. I was trying to say, you are going to be responsible for, pick a topic, I don't know, cybersecurity or architectural design or harness design. You are going to emulate and be that culture within the wider piece, and therefore your understanding of what we're setting out to do and your way of communicating is more important to me, because everyone that follows is going to follow from you. It's going to kind of evolve from that sense. And so at the beginning, I put a huge amount of time into the first line of recruitment. But I made it clear that you are not managers of a team to follow. You are an individual who contributes to the business from day one. And you've got to go and help me build a team around you. As the team grew quite quickly, so it grew from just in my area, one kind of back in Jan 2021 to about 140 over the next 2.5 years. I couldn't be involved in every recruitment exercise, but I did put value in terms of the final interviews, and I would have always a kind of a touch point to have a kind of a meet to make sure that that individual could communicate and was comfortable being in the business, because that was my last touch on, are you going to come in and continue this cultural journey that we're on, or are you just coming because you want to join the startup journey? And I think for the most part, we brought in a lot of people who genuinely wanted to be part of something different, and they were willing to invest in it themselves. And that showed through in the way they were willing to accept tasks and add value, whether it was in their own discipline or tangential to them.
I'm definitely going to remember the bathtub analogy, because I think that's where big organizations get it wrong. They just say, well, if we just decree that the culture is changing, then it will happen. But the bath's already been filled at that point, so you've got a lot more work to do at that point. Let's come on to that final pillar. So we've talked about tech, we've talked about people, process. Sometimes, you alluded to this a little bit earlier as well, sometimes considered a bit of a dirty word, especially when you think of kind of bigger organizations, brings, bureaucracy and things to mind. But clearly an essential part of it, if done right. How do you go about making sure a process is fit for purpose?
Well, I don't think anyone will claim to ever have got it right. The first thing that I would say is that my view on this now is that people talk about tech roadmaps. It's an easy buzzword to use, and it means a lot in those disciplines. We should also be talking about tools and process roadmaps, and we should see DevOps and the idea of a kind of a North Star or a horizon view that you never achieve is just as applicable to how you develop your tools and processes, and you either bin things off or add new ones or you evolve them. And it doesn't mean to just every program put them in the bin and start again. You should treat it like a technology, and you should see it as a continuous development opportunity. So I think once you frame that as your kind of approach, then you can't really get it wrong, other than you just have to be aware of constantly looking at its opportunities to improve or its downfalls and react to them. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, I think for me, appropriateness is again the right thing. So at the beginning, when there was only 10 of us, all that mattered was the first thing we wrote down, we didn't write into MS Word. Because once you start writing in MS Word, everyone will write in MS Word. Or if you're going to start your project plan, don't put it in Excel, because everyone will put it in Excel. So at the very beginning, you can make some very appropriate decisions. And even if the tool you pick is not the tool you end up using for whatever reason, at least you set out with an initiative to say, I'm going to try and use the right tool for the right problem I'm trying to solve today. And then I'll, again, make awareness of that DevOps roadmap process. The other thing is then small things like most organizations have gateways. It's quite a common term, and the gateway by its very nature suggests you're going to go, no go on a gate. Well, if your goal is to deliver in a timeline or as fast as possible, you're not actually going to stop. So don't call it a gateway. I know it's a bit of a cliched kind of nuance, but it's more of a framework now, a framework within which you're going to measure your status and at any point be able to interpret on or off track, risk, and then decide if you're going to do something different or carry on or retime or recost or redefine the product. So for me, thinking about things in terms of like general rule sets as a framework allows you to then, when you get to the actual nuts and bolts of the process, that process isn't the first thing that people pick up. The process is the way you enact upon the day-to-day within a framework, which is within an ethos. And so if your ethos is set out to not be process driven, you'll end up with a very lean process that still controls your business. But it's a process at the end of the day. We are building product to 9001 or another, ISO standards. You can't get away from the fact it needs to be demonstrable, auditable, repeatable. But that doesn't mean it needs to be cumbersome or overly complicated if that's not the type of organization you're in. I think you just need to have interest in it and drive it like all your other technologies.
Yeah, treating it like technology, really interesting insight. Are there any examples where you've seen something and you've like, we need to change this. This is not working, not fit for purpose, where it's really acted as a blocker.
Yeah, quite a few, and I'll be careful not to name companies or anything
Yes,
at this
yeah,
point
yeah.
because every company, every product is good for its own reasons. We you often find as a startup, you jump into bed quite quickly with a big company because they offer most of what you need out the gate. But at that point, you don't know exactly where your company's going. So by which time they've got you into the tool chain and you're not too sure where you're going to go, and you find yourselves in a bit of a difficult challenge. So, a classic example of that is kind of your PLM tool, like your product lifecycle management tools. They're designed for, all organizations of all sizes. Invariably, they require you to use all of the tools that within there. They work better if you do. But at some point, you're then predetermining all your business processes around how it works out the box, unless you've got millions of pounds and years of development to tweak them. So, we had a situation where we couldn't get our tool to do exactly what we wanted. So, insert new tool. We happen to use the Atlassian suite and the Jira tool set. Now, Jira's great for software development. It's great for kind of managing agile sprints and kind of, storyboarding and resource management. But actually, in the same way you open Excel and you do all sorts of things more than just finance, Jira is a blank workspace. It's just an intuitive database if you understand what you're doing. And so we built from the ground up a kind of a Jira interface to our PLM tool, which meant users interacted with a common interface. They understood how to do their job day to day, end to end, but it was in the back end. It was connecting with these robust, big machine tools, and then it was kind of taking that away from the user. So any of the constraints we had in the big tool, we were handling in these agile tools that we could iterate fast, and we could do it for releases, we could do it for issue management, we could do it for change control, whatever it might be. And we curated quite an ecosystem because we had the mindset to say, this is what we want our business to be running like, and here's a tool that we can adapt. Not how does Jira work or how does another tool work.
So the key there being, even if you're stuck with kind of a larger, kind of heavier tool, thinking about the user journey within the company, you can still make it better without exposing them to all the features that you're not using.
Absolutely. And don't forget that users aren't just your own product users. Customers are also your engineering team, who are being paid a lot of money to do a lot of work to get you to the end goal. So if you've got a tool that is absolutely alien or it requires high training, or you only use it once a month and you never know how to do it, you end up recruiting an army of people just to process data. At some point, the make versus buy, going back to my wiring harness example, is such that actually having 2 or 3 heads developing an internal quickly modifiable tool, and you push out updates every few weeks, is a much more lean way of running when you've got a problem, and you just divorce the back end from the front end. And then your users get a more familiar environment with which to interact. Users being engineers at this point, or manufacturing, or whoever.
Yeah, I've definitely been in teams before. We've worked out the kind of the human cost time of getting everybody trained up on something, and thinking, gosh, the reason we said no to that tool is because it cost X amount. But
Yeah.
if we'd have got it in, we would have, because engineers' time stacks up pretty quickly.
Yeah, they know that. I remember talking to one company where they had the best tool, and when I said I'm not going to pick you, they said, "But why? We're best in class." I said, "You are, but the entry point for a user, and I want everyone in the company to use it," which is what surprised them. They thought I was going to have a niche set of engineers who are always using tools like this, and I said, "I want everyone to use it, right?" And therefore, that tool is too scary for them. I need a lighter tool, even if it's not as powerful today, and I'll help them get more powerful, because that's the kind of journey I'll take them on, instead of going with a tool that's fit for purpose today, but I won't get everyone to use it. A great tool not being used, it might as well not be, on your servers.
I'm sure there's lots of engineers listening, vigorously nodding along to that, because it's everybody will have a tool that comes to mind. I won't name and shame, but yes, I think you're bang on the money there. So thinking about those three pillars: tech, people, process, concept to production. Thinking bigger picture, even still, how do you think engineering has changed since you first started your career to the point that you're at today?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to earlier, and maybe I'm coming at it from quite a systems approach, but complexity has increased. Now, there's always been problems and there's always been complexity, but I think the type of problems we've been solving in a kind of design to a kind of a production environment are quite methodical, and therefore the challenges in the technical change, not in the way in which we work. I think what's happening now is that for companies to still be competitive and not delay the launch of products, they need to approach the problem completely differently, which is everything from how they organize themselves, the way they work. And so the idea that you can now just kind of have a team that are responsible for elements of the bill of materials and that they are responsible for their budget or whatever, it doesn't anymore translate. When you talk about a customer feature, that customer feature is not owned by Department X or Department Y. It's owned by parts that they may own, but the software might be over here, the wiring might be over here, the mechanical actuator might be over here, but the customer just heard, I've got adaptive cruise control, or the customer heard, I've just got heated seats. And so I think the way in which we think about engineering a product now, and I'm talking about automotive, but it could apply to any discipline, is you need to understand, again, what problem you're trying to solve, and can you really cost or understand the value that that effort's going to be? Because if you can't, why is that product doing that feature? If it's just because it's always done that feature, challenge the status quo. And I think the mindset is shifting now in terms of what the customers really want and what is the point of sale and what is the post point of sale, and how do you think about engineering life cycles has completely changed. It used to be a design to a production, then an end of life. Now it's a design to production, which is the launch of a platform. And then there's these ecosystems in which we talk about software-defined vehicle or applications and services that continue on long after the customer has taken ownership of the product, which is completely different to how it used to be. Completely different. You have to think about the problem differently as well.
It's not just seeing something sail away out of the forecourt. It's a real kind of full, thinking about how it's going to be used throughout the lifetime. And I think you're right. I think that is completely changing now compared to, it used to be out of sight, out of mind, I think a little bit, back in the...
And now you're money on the servicing schedules, which you're not trying to make that your business model, but it was a very healthy business model. And I think but my point changes every part of the organization. So product have to think differently. Yeah, manufacturing have to think differently. IT and compliance have to think differently. It doesn't matter which part of the organization you're in. That shift is having an impact on all parts of your organization. And as a management team, are you aware of that? And are you making significant changes? I talk about DevOps roadmaps. You've got organizational roadmaps that need to be supporting this as well, even if it's just to get from combustion engines to battery electric. It's not the shift in battery electric that drives this. It's the next generation of vehicles or products that then means what else are you unlocking that you are thinking about in the pipeline, but you're using that product to kind of open that ecosystem up.
Yeah, a really, really good point. I want, because I wish we had more time, but there's two kind of future-facing questions I would like to ask. One electrical specific and one a bit more general. First one, obviously the last decade, electrification has had sweeping impact in a lot of aspects of engineering, particularly in transportation, which is your neck of the woods. How do you see, in the future, what do you think kind of are the big next challenges to kind of overcome in the transport space when it comes to electrification? What do you think are going to be the juicy problems that this next generation of electrical engineers are going to be tucking into?
Well, I mean, if we're specifically talking about electrification then, so the big change is the initial one, which is to move from kind of combustion at point of use to a model where you're using electricity in some fashion. And that is already a change, whether it's a battery electric vehicle or a hydrogen vehicle or a technology, under development. I think once you move to having electric supply of the propulsion system, then you've already done half of the heavy lifting, right? We can argue all day long about whether battery electric vehicles today and all their sustainability and the raw materials, but it's not got the same amount of development as has the 100 years gone by of combustion engines, right? So in the same way, there's a rapid development now, both in the kind of technologies in batteries, the technologies in propulsion systems, and then you start to look at not linked to electrification, but the ability to have connected vehicles that are now modern day equivalents because we are where we are in the industry. Connected vehicles with electrification gets quite interesting because now you can start to think about how energy is used and vehicle to grid starts to come into it, and charging will become the next problem, and whether your vehicle is actually an asset to you stored on your drive beyond just the asset today where it's used, I don't know, I think the stat is about 3% of the time it's in motion, or if even that. The rest of the time it's a dormant asset. Suddenly this asset could become a workhorse for you even when you're not in it. And you start to unlock all sorts of opportunities which weren't there in the combustion engine model. So I think, yes, we're transitioning. Yes, it's early days. And yes, it's, there's a lot of challenges, mainly around is the charging infrastructure ready, let alone the vehicle builds themselves. But I do think once you tip into that form of technology, you can move to hydrogen, it's still an electric motor. You can move to another solid state batteries, it's still an electric motor. And you've made that transition away from fossil fuels.
We've got all these kind of massive batteries sat in our drive now that we can start to think about kind of storage differently. It's not just a vehicle take you from A to B.
When you think about the bigger ecosystem, like renewables into the main grid, the national grid, wind doesn't stop at night, but we're not using energy. You can't store AC. So suddenly you're going to rely upon these charge
Mm.
nodes to actually absorb that energy that you're generating and you don't know what to do with. Or you could use it to make green hydrogen. There's so many opportunities when you move into this space where efficiencies, as we saw them before, are less relevant so long as it's converting to electricity and then used as electricity in the way in which we propel ourselves.
Yeah, it's a very fun problem, that's for sure. My final question to you, and you can pick at this any angle you like, is what are you most excited for at the moment in the world of engineering? What kind of gets you out of bed in the morning, either inside the world of electronics or more broadly? What are you optimistic about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think now is perhaps any more different than perhaps 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's just we sit in the moment looking forward. And I think, as RJ Scannage at Riven used to say, the internet was quite predictable in the 90s. It's just how and when would we have it in our pockets or at home, and how are we going to use the data. So probably we're not really sitting on anything different right now, except I think there's a lot more understanding now of how cross pollination of industries and technologies works. And I think that's going to open doors to things where previously aviation's worked in one way, automotive's worked in another, transport and trains have worked in another. And I think actually the commonality now is that they're all providing a customer centric function. And the more you think about the customer use case, the more you can design the solution. Share technologies, joint ventures will start to come into play. It's no longer the case that you need to, build your own engine. You actually want supply of these parts, and therefore the product is what customers are buying, not the battery in effect. And so it's completely changing the way we think about the ecosystem. And so I'm excited about the fact that I guess we don't yet know what opportunities are around the corner, but I think services and kind of the move to kind of more subscription based and models that we've yet to even think about, which seem unbelievable right now, but so did Netflix at the time when it was Blockbuster Video. And so I think that same shift is due to happen in all sorts of areas, not all, but I think that's around the corner. And it's those that are dreaming it are going to make it a reality, even if a few fail along the way. Because once we have it in 10 years' time, we'll look back and say, well, it was obvious, but
Yeah.
everything's obvious afterwards.
Everything's obvious in hindsight. That's a great note for us to end on. Thanks so much for your candid insights today, Ben. I feel like we've been able to kind of pick from around your bits of experience around the patch, and some really, deep knowledge there with those three pillars: tech, people, process. You can't do it without any of those three. Thank you so much, Ben, and best of luck in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. All the best. Thank you.
Cheers.